And with that, I would like to introduce our closing keynote speaker. Please welcome local legend Sam Barham to the stage.
Thank you, Lisa Blakey, for starting the local legend thing. Now Emily uses it at me every single time she can. So I have my notes and I put them out of order. Oh well, I'll just use the ones down here. So thank you. My brain just froze. So it's been an awesome conference. I'll have to say I am kind of looking forward to getting home to my own bed tomorrow night. But today I'm actually going to talk to you about gardening. It's been a big part of my life, as I'll talk about eventually. But I'm using it as a metaphor and as a lens to talk about both my journey into game development and also about our industry as a whole. To look at how we've been adapting and how we need to continue to show adaptability as we grow and change as an industry. But first I'm going to do the whole bit about me thing. So I am married. I have been married for 22 and a half years. That's my wife, Anna. And I have to tell you, it just keeps getting better and better. So Anna's done a bunch of stuff in her career, all kinds of things, and she got a master's in psychology in 2016, which comes into things later. And she works with me now. She's the managing director to my creative director at Balancing Monkey Games. And I have to give her awesome credit for this talk. She did so much work helping me put all this together. It would not have happened without her. We have 3 kids. So these are Isaac, my oldest, and Maya, my youngest. My other son didn't want to be in the talk, so he's the thumbs up. Isaac has left home. Both of my sons are now taller than me. They like to loom over their poor, short dad, which can be a bit terrifying at times. I am a Christian. I became a Christian when I was 16. I've been walking that path ever since. And we currently go to the Dunedin City Baptist Church, which is a wonderful place full of families and students and old people and just everything in between. Just like I've been married for 22 years, I've been a software developer for 22 years. So I got my start as the motion capture and animator operator for the TV show Squirt, which was a really unfortunate name for a TV show, but it was a great bunch of people to work with and kids absolutely loved it. It was a really cool job. While I was at Animation Research, I also got to help make the simulator that now trains all of our air traffic controllers. And I worked on graphics for live sport, for cricket in particular. So with that, I wound up traveling around the country a few times, operating it, and actually ended up being sent to Bangladesh and India. And if you ever want any of my war stories, they usually start with while I was working in the cricket. I spent a couple of years at Straylight Studios, so shout out to the Straylight alumni that are still here today. It was an awesome place to work. And I've also done a bunch of DevOps and server programming and server architecture and other roles. So all through my career, I've been adapting to new roles. I've been taking on new challenges and growing with them. So today, like I said, I'm talking about gardening and my journey in game development and about our industry as a whole. So there's kind of 3 types of gardening I'm going to talk about. There's pots on the windowsill, gardening, by which I kind of mean veggie gardening, and landscape architecture. And also I'm going to talk a bit about compost, the idea of using what's in your past to feed your future. Now, I do need to give a bit of a content warning here. I am going to be talking about the whole Blizzard Activision thing and about sexual abuse. So if you need to absent yourself, I'll be giving you another warning before that just comes up, and that's absolutely fine. So why gardening? Why am I talking to you about plants? Well, my family are gardeners. My mum is an amazing gardener. She's always got this big garden. She keeps chickens and all the rest of it. My father and my brother are both landscape architects. My other brother is an architectural draftsman. This is photos of a garden that my father designed. So when he gave me these photos, he told me a story about when he created this. The woman that he designed this garden for, she's no longer with us, but at the time she was dying of cancer. And the act of creating this thing, of living in this beautiful thing, of the design and everything, gave her such a new lease of life that she actually became well enough that she travelled to England to visit her family. So we've had a couple of days. It's been awesome. We've had fun. We've met people that we only meet at conferences. We've learned heaps. And now we're going to head back to our day lives, to our studies, to our work, back to our homes. So with this, I want us to think about what's our vision for the industry? What's our vision for where we're going back to and where we're going in the future? But first, we're going to talk about pots on windowsills. So some people, they like growing, pot plants, flowers, herbs, that kind of thing. Emily, our community manager, she grows succulents. So this is usually, it's compared to other kinds of gardening, it's quick, it's clean, it's relatively easy. You're learning a fun new skill. It's not super productive, you're not going to feed your family with it, your house is pretty, your food is more flavourful. It's kind of like game development as a hobby, which leads into my story. So like I said, my wife finished her master's in 2016, and we had a deal. She had spent the last year or two shut in our back room as often as she could writing her thesis, and now it was my turn. And having worked in Straylight Studios about nearly a decade previously, I'd always wanted to get back into game development. So that was what I was going to do. I started learning Unity simply because I was using C# in my day job, so I was adapting to what was on hand. And even though I was coming to this as a hobby, it was just something I was doing for fun when I had a bit of time away from family and things, I had in the back of my mind, this might be a career change one day. I'd like it to be a career change one day. So I did everything I could to learn the industry, learn what I was going to need to know. And I was super lucky at the time. I discovered something called Pro Indie Dev, which was a conference, online conference, series of videos, curated by a guy called Gabriel dos Santos out of Brazil. And it was or a bunch of the really successful, big-name indie developers. And they were talking about how do you do this for a living? How do you make indie games repeatably, even though they fail so frequently? How do you make a living? And I learned so much from them, not about how do you make a game, but how do you run this business of doing game dev for money. So before we leave my game, it's actually the fourth time I've tried to create a strategy game on a sphere, just little hobby projects over the years. The third one was actually my first prototype when I started this, and it was called Pax et Belli, which is Latin for peace and war. My son Isaac was doing Latin at the time, so it seemed fitting. So this was going to be like a super abstract, civilization-like game that you could play in about an hour. And I was quite proud of it. I thought it was going places, I was enjoying working on it, and then I started giving it to my friends and my workmates to have a go at. And the responses was all something along the lines of, yeah, it's okay. And I kept, working on it, trying to make it better. But eventually I realised this is not going anywhere. They're not going, this is the best thing I've ever played. Do not take this away from me or I'll kill you. So, okay, time to shelve that. And that's kind of where Compost comes in. So the next thing I started working on, just, again, trying things out as a hobby, was what was going to become Before We Leave. And this is the first ever piece found in an archaeological dig of concept art for it. So I used Pax et Belli as Compost. A lot of the systems I'd been building I could adapt. A lot of the learnings I'd learned, of course, I could take across. The whole spherical tiled planet that I'd built off various tutorials on the internet I could reuse. So I discarded the bad bits and I kept the good bits. So that was kind of my experience in this pots on a windowsill kind of area. For our industry as a whole, it seems to me that's kind of our infancy, right? Time of asteroids and gods and Prince of Persia and Pac-Man, and maybe, the decade or so after that. You've got this explosion of computing technology out of basically nothing. You've got entire genres being discovered overnight, niches being found and exploited and explored. You've got a series of gold rushes. I particularly remember the gold rush when smartphones were suddenly a thing and you could put your software, your games in people's hands. That was never a thing before in that way. Now, I wasn't a part of the industry at that point, so I don't really have much to say about it, but I actually want to talk to you a bit about children. So, again, these are my oldest and youngest, and one thing you discover if you're a parent, as soon as you have your second child, you discover just how different people are, even right from birth. So Isaac, he really takes life as it comes. We've described him as so laid back he's horizontal. Whereas Maya, our youngest, if everything, even when she was like a tiny baby, if everything was not perfectly just so, she was really upset by it. So why am I telling you about my kids? Apart from, they're my kids and they're cool. Those little babies, they grow up. I can still see in my kids, I can see aspects of how they were when they were just new. But they're more than that now. They're now the product of our parenting, their friends, their schooling, their life experiences, and also all of their choices. And that's kind of like the game dev industry, right? We're no longer in that infancy period. We have grown up. We're now the product of so much more. But there are things left over for good and for bad in our industry. So that's pots on a windowsill. It's relatively simple and easy. It's about having fun. It's about growing your skills, learning new things. It's hobby game development and the infancy of our industry. So the next part to talk about is veggie gardening. So compared to, and I'm not, I was accused of succulent shaming Emily, so I'm not, it's not easy. But compared to that, veggie gardening is quite hard work, right? It's dirty. In Dunedin, where I'm from, it's cold. It's a lot of physical effort. You need to consider your environment. The plants that you're planting, do they want wet soil, dry soil? Do they want sun or shade? Do they want wind or calm? One lesson that we learned, don't plant plants that your family won't eat. And you can apply that to game dev as well. And another thing is you've got to adapt to your environment. Like in our garden, that's right, I was going to show you. This is my veggie garden. I can't actually take credit for this. It's mostly managed by my mother-in-law that lives upstairs from us. And I took these photos, Isaac took these photos in winter, which is why it's a bit dead looking. But we can't grow potatoes here. Other root veggies are fine, parsnips are fine, but if we plant potatoes, they come up lovely and creamy and full of holes because we've got wireworm. So you have to adapt to what you've got. Of course, one of the big things with veggie gardening is you can feed your family. My mother, she never needs to buy veggies unless she wants something that just doesn't grow in Dunedin because she's always got it in her garden already. And another thing you need to think about with veggie gardening, of course, is compost. So once you get down to it, plants are cannibals, right? They live off the remains of their dead. So that's compost. Compost is actually quite complicated to do it right, and I have to admit what I do is we dump all of our veggie scraps in, these are my compost bins, and then I wait for my dad to get frustrated with the lack of progress and come and do all the magical stuff that turns it into real compost. And it's kind of like that with game dev, not the getting someone else to do it part, the growing out of what's their part. Failed prototypes find new life in reusing the technology or taking the ideas from them to build something else. Or you're working on a thing and it doesn't work out, and while you're doing it, you get another idea that does work out. And it's the same for people. We feed our bodies and even our souls on our past experiences, on what we want, what we put in now. So back to kind of my journey, the veggie gardening part of it. So this kind of started when I heard about NZGDC and the Kiwi Game Starter. And I was like, seems like a good idea, I'll give that a go. And it was really helpful. It gave me a deadline. All of a sudden, instead of just faffing about making a game because I felt like it, I had to produce a demo by a deadline. But it was actually way more powerful than that. To enter the Kiwi Game Starter, you need to submit a marketing plan and a budget and comparison with other games in the genre and how do you fit into the space. So that focused me on the reality of making games. And that was super useful. So the first year I entered, I was a finalist, even though my game looked like that. But the coolest thing that happened was a little while later, someone turned up and they're like, would you like some funding? Now, I thought they meant like, a little bit to help out with some art assets, but no, it was enough funding for me to work full-time for a year, to hire an artist, to get some PR work done, which was just, okay, cool. So it has to be said, a large pay cut and a lot of trepidation, but also the blessing of my wife and my children, I took it. I quit my day job and I became a full-time game developer. Now, I was actually really worried about this. For my entire career, 18 years by that point, I had worked for the man. I had worked in offices, I had been surrounded every day by people. And here I was going to be working from home in the back room, seeing no one all day. But I adapted to it. And there's a couple of things in particular that I did. So the first one was I was used to working 9 to 5. So I stuck to my schedule. I didn't have to commute anymore. So every morning about 8, I was at my desk, showered, dressed, ready to go, and I stopped at 5. And spent time with my family and played games and all that kind of stuff. And the other thing that I did was I was already on the New Zealand Game Dev Slack, which is an awesome wee community, and I said, hey, can I start a channel? So I started a indie stand-up, and every morning at 10 a.m. or at different times, because various people had different schedules, you'd turn up and do a quick stand-up meeting. What did you do yesterday? What are you hoping to achieve today? Is there anything in the way? And just having that little community of other people, other hobby game developers, even a couple of professional solo indie devs, that little community was amazingly helpful and so supportive. It was a really great, and it was amazing meeting them when I first came to NZGDC. No, second came, it was cool. Now, this is also the time when I first encountered what I'm thinking of as landscape architecture later in the talk, when I realised the direction the game was already heading in, of sort of taking away the violence and deciding to lean into that and to make this game become what I'd like to see in the world. So I was now a full-time game developer, worked really hard for a while, and then June 2019, I announced my game. So we put a huge amount of work into this, creating a good trailer, getting all the right websites ready to go, having a Discord community ready to go, and it went really, really well. Our community grew by thousands, had tens of thousands of views on the video. I had an article in Rock, Paper, Shotgun, which to me is like, okay, I am now truly a game developer. And then, but even better than that, a couple of months later, some publishers turn up saying, hey, can we publish your game for you? And then Epic Games turn up. Say, hey, would you like to release your game exclusive on our store? Now, if you've been following my journey, you know that that is indeed the deal we took, but why? For me, it basically came down to advice from the wonderful Tim Ponting. He said to me, if you go with a publisher, then bits of the game development process are going to be hidden from you. The QA, the marketing, the release process, they'll just do it and you won't see it. So if we went that way and then we came to make a new game, we wouldn't know what that part of the process was like. We wouldn't be able to make good decisions about did we want to do it with a publisher or indie again. So going indie, even though it meant there would be more on us, more that we had to do, it made sense. It was still a really difficult decision to make. There was, of course, all of the anti-Epic hate going on, all that sentiment. Again, we were really quite lucky. It was tapering off at that point, and also we'd done the work building a community. We had a nice community waiting for a nice game. So when we announced that we were changing to on Epic, I mean, there was some grumbling and a couple of jerks, but nothing horrible. They gave us an advance, which meant I could hire people. I had employees for the first time ever, which is a real mind shift, I tell you. So we hired Isaac, not my son, a different Isaac, although their partners do also have the same name. So he's our second programmer and our technical artist. We also hired Emily, who's our community manager and our social media manager and our trailer maker and about 50 million other things. So this is the first time we met in person. Emily's in Auckland. And it was cool, it was great. So all through this, I kind of realized that adaptability, right? It's about knowing yourself. It's about discovering the things that you don't know and working out how do you learn them or how do you find someone to help you with them. So now, time to move on to gardening in our industry. So this is kind of where we're at, right? We're making useful and beautiful things, we're feeding our families, but there's also some dirty things. Now, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and this is the part where I give you the blizzard and sexual abuse warning, but I'm going to talk about something else first. First, I want to talk about crunch and pay. So as you all know, the game dev community has a problem with crunch. There's also, you get crunch in other industries, right? Lots of industries. I want to tell you about my experiences. In one of my previous jobs, we had crunch, which was when our 37.5 minimum hours per week became 42.5, and that was for a week or two. There was one time when we were required to work 50 or 60 hours a week for a month because we had a massive product coming out and we had to hit the deadline. Whereas crunch in game dev can be brutal. The only time I've tried to pull an all-nighter was in game dev. Before we leave, I'm so thankful, was largely done without crunch, apart from one very memorable point where I personally pulled 16-hour days for 2 weeks, getting the final user interface in just before launch. The industry is full of stories of death marches for months, for years, for real people destroyed for a piece of entertainment, for value for the shareholders, or because of badly managed expectations. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, right? It boils down largely to a failure of planning, but that's because planning in software is hard. We're a young industry, not just games, software in general. We have not been building games or software for hundreds of years. We're not building bridges. And we don't build out of physical stuff. We're not limited by bricks and wood. We're not required to obey the physics of metal or the supply chains of nails, which means we can build out of infinite thought stuff. We can build out of clouds of possibility, which makes it so much harder not to overreach, because we can do anything. So what's to stop us from doing anything? And that leads to either badly managed expectations or failed projects or crunch. The other thing I need to talk about, of course, is pay in game dev. We got a very specific lesson in this recently. We offered someone a job, and the maximum that we could afford to pay them was 2/3 of what they were getting in normal software development. Now, this is absolutely not an excuse, but it occurred to me that this has always been a problem in creative industries. Starving artist is a phrase for a reason. And, I mean, the reasons are far too complex for me to fit into my brain or to go into now. But it occurred to me that it's kind of because it's not boring. I had a realization a few years ago that what you're actually paid for when you're doing a job is the boring bits. If you had a job that was all awesome all the time, no one's going to pay you for it. That's a hobby. And the other problem with with creative industries in general is that they're risky. Everyone, I imagine, knows the stats. Something like 90% of games fail to make back what they cost to make. But I want to tell you about what we're doing at Balancing Monkey Games to try and push back on this. So currently, we are even in our gender FTE, full-time employment, and our pay approximately between men and women. We are completely open with what we paid. Everyone internally knows what everyone gets, including me. And of course, we're fairly strongly standing against crunch in the industry. So I'm not for a second excusing crunch or low pay, but they're not entirely like black and white, right? They're complex issues, but there are some things that are black and white. According to the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey 2018, 34% of women in New Zealand suffer sexual abuse at some point in their lives, and yet we keep making this. Given the horrifying toll of sexual abuse on all of us, not just on women, how can we excuse this? How can we keep doing this? How can we keep feeding this into the world? And I know there's worse out there. I wanted to keep the slides, PG. Sexism in games has its own Wikipedia page. That's just wrong. And of course, that means that we need to talk about Activision and Blizzard. They've been in the news recently for all the worst of reasons, as have Ubisoft and Riot and lots of individuals. I was just hearing about another one yesterday. For all kinds of disgusting practices, institutionalized practices. It speaks for itself. As a world, we need to be better than this. But even more importantly, as game developers, we need to be better than this. There's a particular reason for that I'm going to talk about later. There is a small silver lining to all of this horribleness. At least now it's starting to get called out. It's no longer as hidden as it once was. People are standing up, finally, for what's right. So there's one more thing that we need to talk about before we get to the good stuff. Our world has a terrible problem with violence, with seeing other people as things, with an obsession with punishment and with blame, and yet we keep making this. Again, why are we doing this? Now, I know the research, right? Playing violent games does not directly cause violent behaviour. But I have to say, every time we trot that out, every time we're accused of it, it's starting to sound a little childish. We are actively involved in representing people who are other as something that can be killed, maimed, destroyed for fun. Now, this is not some moralistic crusade against violent games. They can be fun, they can be cathartic, they can tell powerful stories. But we need to be so much more careful and thoughtful than we have been about why we're creating these, why we're doing it. But like I said, there's lots of good stuff too. So, more so than any other creative industry, like in history, we can tell amazing stories. It's been mentioned several times, but Umurangi Generation, that just won the Seamus McNally IGF Grand Prize and the Storytelling Prize. How cool is that? That's awesome. From my own game playing, I want to highlight a few. So Never Alone is a game, it's made by Inuit. It's telling Inuit stories. And it's also got these amazing documentary segments showing you their lives, their struggles, their stories that you unlock as you play. Another one is Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice. Now, this is a very violent game, but the protagonist in it, Senua, she's a woman suffering from psychosis. When I finished this, I sat there and I let the feelings of the ending wash over me and I cried, which is the only time that's happened to me in games. It wasn't because I recognised myself in Senua, it was because it gave me the opportunity to recognise someone else, to see someone suffering through psychosis and abuse in her case. And it gave me a window to see just a little bit of what it might be like for a real person to suffer through these things. There's a lot more to do, but as an industry, we're doing so much better in our representations of diversity and in the creation of wholesome games like Unpacking and Ooblets and Bear and Breakfast, which I think is a wonderful name. Again, there's more to do, but we're taking great strides in our work with people with disabilities. Microsoft is doing amazing work here. And I want to highlight one game. So I played the demo of this while I was writing this talk, The Veil. In The Veil, the protagonist is a blind princess, and the game is played entirely without visual cues. The screen is blank. It's all just audio, and it is amazing to play. You should all try it. It's on Steam for free as a demo. It's incredible. So that's veggie gardening. That's the gardening phase. As an industry, we're growing up. We've left behind our infancy. We're starting to deal with the issues that are left over from it. But I think it's time for us to think about leaving gardening, to start considering our legacy, the architecture, the landscape that we are creating. We are required to continue making our own choices. So that brings us to landscape architecture. So this can be anything from the garden of a single house to citywide park developments. It's expensive, of course it is. It's about big things. So this is the town belt in Dunedin. I believe you've got something similar here in Wellington. The original Dunedin town planners decided that there would be a strip between the CBD and the suburbs that was undeveloped. It's all bushes and parks and walks. As an early teen, I spent a heap amount of time in the town belt building huts and messing around. So in Dunedin and I guess in Wellington, we owe a lot to those town planners, to their vision of the future. So how does landscape architecture relate to my journey? We kind of need to take a bit of a step back. So we released a game in May of 2020, like a few weeks after our major lockdown ended. All of a sudden, real people were paying money for my game. Better than that, real people were enjoying my game. We had someone leave a comment saying that our game helped them through a really hard time. We nearly cried when we read that. There were some initial wobbles, of course. This is a first-time game made by a first-time team. But we dealt with them and we started updating the game, doing the whole sort of post-release support and preparing for heading for Steam a year later. And then we got a new curveball. 6 weeks before we were due to launch on Steam, Team 17 turned up saying, "Hey, would you like to publish your game with us?" Now, I remember them from when I was a teenager playing Alien Breed and Super Frog and Worms, and I was like, oh, these guys are cool. So, of course, we went with them. And it's doing great. We're adapting to the differences between being like an agile indie and working with a publisher. And the reason that we decided to go with them, again, it came back to Tim's advice. Here we had the chance in one game to compare both ways of doing it. We knew what it was like releasing it as a relatively unsupported agile indie, and now we could see what it was like releasing a game with a publisher, with all the differences in how that works. We'd be able to compare apples with apples as we moved forward. So we kind of couldn't say no. So all through this progress, all from hobby to doing it as a job, to having a team, to the release, to now, we've been adapting to these new experiences. We've been deciding what do we want to become. We've been moving from pots to gardening to architecture, and now we're sort of starting to consider our future. What do we want to be as a studio? Where do we want to go? What impact do we want to have? Now, before I talk about like the industry, I want to tell you about Rock Solid. So South Dunedin, where we have our studio, is one of the poorest urban areas in the country. And a few years back, some churches got together and they decided to create a trust to help the people of South Dunedin. And that trust runs the Rock Solid youth programs, youth clubs. There's several sort of for different ages. There's one for primary school kids and a couple of different brackets for high school kids. I'm a volunteer leader with the intermediate club. I'm on the left there behind someone's hand. So every Wednesday during term time, they come along, we give them dinner, and we play some daft games with them, or take them to the beach, or take them bowling, that kind of thing. And some of the kids that come along, they're what I'd call normal kids, from normal families, but some of them really are not. Rock Solid is the only place where I've had to break up a fight. One day, we were playing some daft game, I think it was Duck, Duck, Goose, and there was a girl sitting out. So I did my leader thing, I went along, do you want to join in the game kind of thing? And she said something that is going to stick with me forever. She said, I don't like playing this game, I have to play it with my father when I visit him in prison. Some of these kids, they have no hope. They tell us that Rock Solid, 3 hours on a Wednesday evening, is the high point of their lives. Some of these kids, their lives is basically nothing but sex and darkness and violence and drugs, and they're 11. Now, why am I telling you this? Because these kids, one of the things they love is video gaming. We have so much reach and influence into our culture. Like I've alluded to previously, and this is where Anna's Masters comes in, from a neuropsychological point of view, far more than any other creative medium, we change people's brains when they play our games. We are rewiring people. So our legacy, our landscape architecture, it's not a physical thing. It's not a building. It's not a bridge. It's not a park. It is those infinite clouds of thought stuff, the infinitely malleable, infinitely adaptable creativity that we can create. Our legacy is the stories we tell. Our legacy are the people that we change with what we create. Do we want our legacy to be abuse and violence and broken people? Or do we want to empower a new generation with the stories that we tell? So let me ask you, where are you in your journey? Are you growing things in pots? Are you feeding your family? Or are you designing the landscape? Wherever you think you are, I want to tell you you're part of this landscape. Whether you've released a game, even if it's a free student project on itch, if you're working with someone, if you're working for someone, if you're paying people, you're part of the landscape that we're building. What kind of landscape do we want to create? Thank you.